Well, thank you so much for inviting me here. I was trying to think when I was last here at RIHN, and I'm sure it was somewhere in the vicinity of 10 or 15 years ago. And I was saying to someone last night, my normal principle is not to do long trips during July and August, but I made an exception because I think what you're trying to do here at RIHN is so important that I could hardly not accept the invitation to come. So steering towards sustainability, in the course of these remarks I will try to say something that relates to the governance of socio-ecological systems, bridging scales, and the role of equity, which are the three themes of the substantive sessions of the conference, and also looking at the sort of questions of sustainability from local to global levels. So when we think about steering, let me start by just giving you some sense of the overview, the main points that I will try to cover in the next 45 minutes or so. When we think about steering, we immediately come to focus on the question of governance, where governance is conceived of as a social function centered on steering societies away from collectively bad outcomes, failure to supply collective goods, the tragedy of the commons, things of that kind, and toward good outcomes, the achievement of sustainability. In every case, dealing with this social function requires creating and administering governance systems that are able to influence or guide the behavior of various kinds of subjects. Now, I deal with this set of questions largely on a large scale. When you hear FICRIT, I think you hear much more about small-scale systems, but similar fundamental kinds of issues. When we think of governance in international society, we're immediately thinking about situations involving cross-scale interactions, where we're creating and trying to move from paper to practice systems to guide the actions of states, and in some cases, various types of non-state actors, which may be very diverse. So we're trying to create, at the macro scale, these governance systems which are able to guide or to influence, to steer the behavior of a variety of actors or subjects. This opens up several topics for analysis, which are the central themes that I want to touch on this afternoon. So what is the range of behavioral mechanisms that are or can be used to guide the behavior of actors? What are the different kinds of behavioral mechanisms? The second has to do with the fit, if you like, the match between the mechanisms that are chosen for purposes of governance and the relevant problems, the characteristics of the relevant problems, or the relevant actors, the subjects. So this is what we call, in my world, the problem of fit. The third is what you might think of as the gap between the ideal and the actual. We know that whatever the governance systems are on paper, there's a requirement to move these governance systems from paper to practice. And governance systems in practice generally differ in some significant ways from what they might look like on paper. So when you observe the reality after you've read the documents, you may be somewhat surprised, and in some cases the divergence may be quite dramatic. And the fourth topic is the role of equity in dealing with steering toward sustainability. So those are the four sets of topics I want to think about in this presentation. I'm going I'm going to throw out a lot of ideas and move through them fairly quickly. But of course we can come back to any of these ideas either in this session or throughout the next 2 days for purposes of discussion. I'm more than happy to talk in greater detail about any of the issues. So, governance systems at different levels of social organization make use of a variety of behavioral mechanisms to guide the actions of subjects. That is, the members of the governance system and any other relevant actors who are within the jurisdiction of the government that we're looking at. Here is a preliminary list of different kinds of behavioral mechanisms. These are, of course, in some sense, ideal types, they're analytic distinctions, but it's useful, I think, to make these distinctions for purposes of understanding the fundamental differences in the ways in which different systems, different societies endeavor to address questions of governance. And of course, we'll look at the end at hybrid systems. I want to talk quite briefly about each of these different types of behavioral mechanisms. So in Western thinking, we tend to assume, almost without thinking, that governance, that the behavioral mechanism involves the creation of rules, that we're dealing with rule-based governance, where rules are thought of as prescriptions that tell subjects what they must do or must not do under specified circumstances. And in fact, this notion of rule-based governance is very much associated with the ideal in Western systems of the rule of law, which is a kind of a sacred concept which many Westerners assume is universal, but in fact is not universal, but is one particular strategy, one particular way of addressing the question of behavioral mechanisms. So rules include typically requirements. You must do something under various kinds of circumstances. For example, you must obtain emissions permits to emit greenhouse gases or other kinds of pollutants, let's say, and prohibitions. You must not do various things. For example, you must respect no fishing zones, which say you may not fish here, or you may not use a certain gear type, or you may not fish in a certain season of the year. When you're looking at rule-based governance, the fundamental issues that then become a focus of research and analysis are, first of all, monitoring, reporting, and verification. How can you know whether the rules are making a difference, are in fact guiding behavior, unless you're able to track, to monitor, to report, and verify? And then, of course, once you can monitor, if you see gaps between the rules and the actual behavior, issues of compliance, and if needed, enforcement come very much to the top of the agenda. Many people in this way of thinking focus on enforcement systems and think that's really a kind of central issue. And finally, when you think about rule-based governance, we're interested in creating mechanisms, creating arrangements to provide authoritative interpretations of the rules in cases of disagreements about the application of the prescriptions to specific situations. This is the role of courts and tribunals, but also other kinds of authoritative interpretive mechanisms. So this is rule-based governance, often thought of as the main option in Western thinking, but not the only one. So now we might think about principles-based governance. So what are principles and how do they differ from rules? So principles are normatively grounded codes of proper conduct in specified domains. Often we think of those in terms of ethics. So we're all very familiar in most of our societies with legal ethics or medical ethics. So principles are not the same as rules. Principles are ethical guidelines rather than prescriptions. They're often based on what we in the social sciences think of as the logic of appropriateness, as normatively preferred strategies or behavioral standards that ought to be followed in given kinds of situations. So we can think about a variety of environmental principles, for example, the polluter pays, the precautionary principle, common but differentiated responsibilities, and so forth and so on. These are not questions, these are not rules in the sense that we are going to try to enforce compliance, but we try to disseminate these as ethical norms, as guidelines that actors should follow to the best of their ability. So, for example, we have codes of conduct, like some of you will have heard of the Equator Principles. And so when it comes to the question of moving from paper to practice with principles-based governance, we're normally thinking about socialization rather than the promulgation of regulations. We're thinking about the incorporation, the internalization in people or other actors of these normative principles, normative codes. We often then think about norms and social pressures as the mechanisms for achieving conformance rather than enforcement to achieve compliance. So, for example, we might have a mechanism like naming and shaming, calling out those who are not acting in conformance to ethical principles and shaming them in the eyes of some relevant community. So this is a second kind of behavioral mechanism. This is quite different from a third sort of mechanism, which we often call goal-based governance. So goals are priority objectives to be pursued during a specified period of time as a matter of urgency, whereas rules are normally thought of as lasting indefinitely. Once the laws are incorporated in the legal system, they go on more or less indefinitely, but goals are apt to be associated with more or less specific periods of time. So, for example, you have goals like half the number of people living on less than $1.25 a day. Many of you will recognize that as MDG 1 from the Millennium Development Goals of 2000, to be achieved in the 15-year period, 2015, or eradicate smallpox. You recognize this perhaps as a goal that was set as a priority in the 1970s in a campaign led by the World Health Organization to eradicate smallpox. So the elements of goal-based governance are to set priorities, to establish priorities, to allocate resources, to assign personnel, and to launch a campaign focused on a particular goal, and then to monitor progress, to say, are we 25%, 50%, 75%? Many of you will have seen those nice thermometers that are often associated with campaigns to say, how far have we made it? We need to redouble our efforts. And so this leads directly to the politics of prioritization. Goal-based governance as a mechanism to influence behavior works if you can set priorities and say this for this time period would be our top priority, or one or two. And this is a very hard thing to do. Many of you have worked in, as you all have, research institutes or university departments who are trying to set priorities. Who should we try to hire next? Now, setting priorities is very hard. And you can think about the Sustainable Development Goals from 2015. If you look at the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, it's fairly hard to think of any major international issue which can't be fit into one of those 17 priorities. I understand why that happened, but nevertheless, that's a problem. So as an alternative to the Western preference for the rule of law, goal-based governance may be compatible with other kinds of systems. For example, those systems in which planning is a central practice, in which you have, for example, the development of 5-year plans, in which a 5-year plan may say, for this 5-year period, let's say the current 13th 5-year plan in the PRC, we're going to set certain specific kinds of goals for that 5-year period. We're going to launch a campaign, and at the end of that time, we may move on to the next 5-year plan. So in plan systems, goal-based governance often seems like a more compatible approach. Then, next you have what many of us call pledge-based governance. Pledges are voluntary commitments that members of regimes or other key actors make regarding their contributions to the achievement of collectively defined objectives. Pledges are voluntary. I don't have to make a pledge. But actors may be subject to a fair amount of social pressure to pledge generously. For example, many of you will perhaps be familiar with the concept of tithing, associated very much with Christianity, I guess, but the idea that people should contribute voluntarily a significant part of their income to the support of the church, in return for which you are promised guaranteed access to top rank in the next world. But still, pledges may vary in kind and in size, depending upon the circumstances of individual actors. One of the interesting things about pledge-based governance is that pledges may be quite different. Those who are in different circumstances pledge what they are in a position to contribute to the collective agenda of solving various kinds of problems. So, for example, I'll come back to this in a moment, think about the nationally determined contributions under the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. If you look at those NDCs, they vary dramatically in all kinds of respects. They reflect what different members of the agreement felt in a position to pledge in that time period. And this leads to the notion of what we call pledge and review. So the idea is that pledges should be reviewed on a periodic basis to take stock, to evaluate, are the pledges being fulfilled? Are the pledges sufficient to address the needs for governance? And do we need to strengthen the pledges? Do we need to, as we say in the trade, ratchet up, as to increase the strength of the pledges for the next time period? And so this is the mechanism of step by step, period by period, ratcheting up, which is the characteristic dynamic of pledge-based governance. And then we have standards-based governance. So standards are performance criteria that actors must meet in order to receive some sort of certification. Some of you, certainly in my world, this is very high profile, but some of you might know the LEED system of rating green buildings on a silver, gold, and platinum basis, depending upon whether the building and its construction and operation meets certain standards. I happen to work in a LEED Platinum certified building, which was the first laboratory building in the United States to be LEED certified. And we take that very seriously, and we have to be recertified every 7 years. And so we work our tail feathers off to keep our platinum certification. But there are various kinds of certification, standards-based governance schemes at the international level. One thinks about things like the Forest Stewardship Council or the Marine Stewardship Council for certification of sustainable harvesting practice, with ISO guidelines like ISO 26000, guidelines on social responsibility. In standard-based governance, subjects are normally non-state actors, and certification procedures are often administered by non-state actors like the FSC, the MSC, and so on. So why should actors participate if certification is in some sense voluntary? You're not obligated to meet these certification standards. Well, there are a number of reasons which may lead actors to be more or less serious about meeting standards of one kind or another. Branding, for example. We want to say we have a LEED Platinum building. That's our brand. We've publicized that far and wide. This is related to the notion of reputation. We stake our reputation. We announce our distinctive brand in these terms. There may be considerations of corporate social responsibility. And there are, of course, issues in standards-based governance of monitoring and recertification requirements. So these, of course, are not necessarily mutually exclusive, but there are analytically different behavioral mechanisms. They are the inventory of strategies or mechanisms that those trying to construct governance systems may turn to in their effort to achieve sustainability, for example, to achieve whatever the collective goal is. Sometimes these mechanisms are employed singly, but also sometimes in various combinations. So think about, as an example in my world, because I deal with large-scale international governance systems, think about the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement as a hybrid case. So the 2015 agreement first articulates an operational common goal. It takes what was Article 2 of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is very vague and general, and says, operationally, this means that our goal is to limit temperature increases above pre-industrial levels to 2 degrees Celsius and to strive for a limit of 1.5. The agreement also implies a pledge and review system. I already mentioned the nationally determined contributions and the periodic global stock take, as it's called in the Paris Agreement. Every 5 years, there should be a review. There are rules as well. There are requirements regarding monitoring, reporting, and verification. And there are principles of, for example, the role of common but differentiated responsibilities that apply to Article 1 and non-Article 1 countries under the UN Framework Convention. So this is not uncommon to have, on a big issue of this kind, a system which tries to bring to bear a combination of different behavioral mechanisms. So with that sort of toolkit, let's talk about questions of fit, or the match, the second broad theme I mentioned at the outset. There are links between problem types and the suitability or effectiveness, the usefulness, shall we say, of different behavioral mechanisms. So rather than saying we want to choose the right behavioral mechanism and then that's our go-to strategy, we want to say we have a toolkit. We have a set of different strategies, and our challenge is to select the most effective, the best, the most relevant tool for, or set of tools for a particular situation. Let me just give you some simple examples to illustrate this. We spend a lot of time thinking about the question of the relationship between the characteristics of problems and the attributes of governance mechanisms, but I'll just illustrate with a couple of suggestions. So one has to do with the regulation or the governance of ongoing activities that are likely to last for the indefinite future versus situations where you can produce a once-and-for-all solution. If our goal or objective is to eradicate smallpox, and which we did successfully, we don't need to continue to focus lots of attention on the governance of a campaign to address the problem of smallpox. Once it's done, it's more or less done, and we might move on to the next priority, the next goal. But there are other situations where this is going to be a long-term kind of issue. For example, suppose we are interested in the regulation or the governance of bioengineering. We're concerned about the potential of germline editing. That's not going to go away. The potential of germline editing is going to be with us for the indefinite future. So we may need to choose some kind of rule-based or principle-based governance system to deal with that issue, that kind of problem. Or, for example, let's take a situation in which the actors are very diverse in terms of their circumstances, their capacity to contribute. So it doesn't make sense under a situation like that kind to have a blanket regulatory system that says everybody must do the same thing, to have requirements and prohibitions which are universal across the board. We have to say, what's the capacity of different actors in the system to contribute to the achievement of whatever the objective, whatever the governance problem is. And so we may need to leave room for various contributions, different types of pledges, for example, on the part of individual actors toward the supply of a collective or a public good, and so forth and so on. So this is a big focus of research and analysis dealing with the development of effective governance systems, fitting the behavioral mechanisms to the type of problem. We also have a question of fit with respect to the types of actors in the system. So there are links between types of actors or subjects and the success of different kinds of behavioral mechanisms. So, as I mentioned at the outset, when we're dealing at the global level, trying to develop global regimes to deal with long-term resilience of socio-ecological systems, we're immediately dealing with cross-scale interactions. International society, if we just think of it as a society of states, as a diverse collection of states from China, the United States, to Tuvalu, Vanuatu, and so forth and so on. And so, obviously, we need to create systems that allow different members of international society, much less non-state actors, to participate in ways that are appropriate for them. And so, if some societies if some countries, for example, are rule of law systems, but other countries are more largely planned systems, we must create international governance mechanisms that allow each type of country to participate according to its own characteristics, according to its own capabilities. Also, for example, if we're dealing with a situation in which the subjects of the governance system are individuals versus subjects which are in some sense collective entities, like states. When we're dealing with collective entities, we often find ourselves dealing with what are known as two-level games. Some of you are often familiar with this notion that the positions or the performance of countries in international governance systems is very often a consequence of an internal bargaining and negotiation process within that individual country. And so we need to create an international governance system that allows for this second order negotiation process within individual member countries, which may not be the case when we're dealing with individuals. So this is another big set of concerns that we look at, or that we spend a lot of time when we're thinking about, for example, designing governance systems. What are the characteristics of the problem? What are the attributes of the actors? What should we do in terms of the creation of governance systems? So we spend a great deal of time fighting against the idea of panaceas, or simplified prescription applied across a wide set of situations. Some of you may have read the work of people like Oran R about beyond panaceas. The idea is that we need to think hard about specific situations, create governance systems that work with respect to the specific situations, rather than having one size fits all. So then the third of the set of topics that I identified at the beginning that I want to talk to you about, the ideal and the actual. This, of course, is a very familiar notion, at least in the social science community, that in the world in general, we face a challenge of minimizing the gap between the ideal and the actual. When we're thinking about behavioral mechanisms that guide or steer the behavior of various kinds of actors with respect to, for example, steering towards sustainability, we know that it's one thing to create a system on paper, negotiate, to enact a statute, to negotiate a law, even to develop some kind of informal norms and practices of the sort that people like Fickert look at in terms of small-scale systems. But in virtually every case, mechanisms in use differ from mechanisms on paper. And we know that there's a gap. There's nothing surprising. This is not a matter of evil creeping into the system. This is human behavior. So let me give a couple of illustrations of the gap. So thinking about rule-based governance, where we're trying to develop a law with requirements and prohibitions, and to translate that into some operational regulations. Lots of things can go wrong with rule-based governance that would create a gap between the ideal and the actual. You may have legislative gridlock. It may be very difficult for the relevant mechanism to arrive at any kind of agreement regarding the terms, the content of the rules. I come from a place where the last time we were able to pass a major environmental piece of legislation was in 1990. Gridlock on the legislative front. Since then, well, that's a long time in terms of development of environmental problems. We may have a large amount of bureaucratic red tape. It may be slow and difficult to move from the rules on paper to the operational regulations. There may be political or economic corruption. There may be players in the system who see opportunities for self-interested behavior to serve their own ends rather than the public ends. There may be endless legal battles. Again, I come from a system where we pride ourselves on the rule of law, and that means that when we don't like something, we file a lawsuit. And lawsuits can go on for years and years and years. Now, I'm not saying all these bad things always happen, but these are the pitfalls, shall we say, that have to be dealt with. We have to be alert to these kinds of pitfalls. And so rule-based governance can easily sort of slide into a gap between the ideal and the actual for any or several of those reasons. Goal-based governance, to take a second example, also has various kinds of pitfalls, which are by no means uncommon in creating a gap between the ideal and the actual. For example, as I suggested before in thinking about the Sustainable Development Goals, there may be inadequate prioritization. At the end of the day, the negotiation process around setting priorities may be extremely difficult. And exhausted negotiators may say, well, let's just adopt all these priorities. But too many priorities, from a governance perspective, is much like having no priorities. It doesn't allow you to concentrate resources, to assign personnel, to launch a campaign, to track progress. There may be imprecise indicators, an effort to create monitoring systems. The UN in the Sustainable Development Goals has several hundred indicators. Not an easy system to manage when you're trying to say, are we making progress with respect to the fundamental goal of goal-based governance. There may be insufficient resources. What is more common than setting goals with one hand, but then with the other hand, concluding that just aren't enough resources? You might think that's a little bit illogical, but then collective decision-making processes, whoever said they were logical or rational, it's perfectly common to say, well, on the one hand, we set these priorities, on the other hand, we didn't really, it's a different set of players who control the purse strings or allocate the resources. And there may be poor leadership. One of the things we discover with goal-based governance, again and again and again, the goal-based initiatives that really produce results, when you look hard, you almost always find one or more effective leaders. So just because you set goals on paper doesn't mean something is necessarily going to happen. When something happens, it's often because someone or some group of people who have leverage in the system for whatever reason pick up a goal and say, we're going to drive this process and make something happen. Again, these are pitfalls. It's not inevitable that goal-based governance will fall into these pitfalls, but they are common dangers. And I could go through a similar kind of analysis with respect to the other behavioral mechanisms that I mentioned earlier on. But in all cases, we're concerned about the gap. Mind the gap between the ideal and the actual. And so we're often concerned about closing the gap. We're not going to eliminate the gap, but we might close the gap. So we want to be very careful about fitting the mechanisms we choose to the prevailing conditions we're working with. Choose mechanisms that are as well matched to the conditions you're operating with as possible. And always we want to maintain vigilance, to track progress, to make adjustments to changing circumstances. And by the way, that's a very important notion in the area of fit. If we're now operating in a world of complex, rapidly changing systems, we want governance mechanisms, behavioral mechanisms that are comparatively easily adjustable. Many rule-based systems have the characteristics of becoming locked in, difficult to adjust in the light of changing circumstances. So maintaining vigilance, tracking progress, and making adjustments. Now let me close with some few remarks on the fourth set of themes that I identified at the beginning. The role of equity. This is not an area of great expertise on my part, but since I see that this is a concern of this research program, I thought I would be remiss if I didn't make an effort to say a few things about the role of equity in terms of the governance, the mechanisms, behavioral mechanisms that I've been talking about. So where does equity fit into this picture? Well, in all cases, it's difficult to evaluate performance of governance systems. We often think in terms of at least these four criteria of evaluation. I'm massaging terminology a little bit, but it allows me to call them the four E's. Effectiveness, are we solving the problem? Efficiency, are we doing it in a cost-effective manner? Equity, are we doing it in a way that conforms to some standards of fairness or justice? And are the results enduring in the sense of being sustainable? All of these criteria are exceedingly difficult to analyze because of the problem of establishing causality. To create a governance system, something happens with respect to the issue that you're concerned with, and you want to know to what extent did the governance system cause that outcome to occur. Well, establishing causal connectivity in a world in which there is very little opportunity for experimentation is exceedingly difficult. Occasionally we have things that look a bit like natural experiments. We grab those as quickly as possible, but it's difficult. And of course, we're always dealing in a multi-causal world. And so sorting out the relative contribution of one driver or another is difficult. And more often than not, at least in the human dimension, we're dealing with a world of what people call conjunctural causation. I don't know if any of you are familiar with the methodology called qualitative comparative analysis, but it's a methodology that looks at situations, systems where you can't really assign weights to individual independent variables, but you're looking at conjunctions. You're looking at several driving forces working together. So all of these things create difficulty for identifying performance in terms of any of the four E's, and certainly with respect to the issue of equity. So just a couple of thoughts that I've had that may be relevant to thinking about the role of equity in these situations. One is that there are, of course, a variety of different conceptions of equity and fairness. One of the most important, I think, has to do with the distinction between procedural equity, equity in terms of processes, and substantive equity, equity in terms of outcomes, for example, distributive equity. Do we care more about procedural equity, whether the outcome was arrived at through some fair process, or do we care mainly about substantive equity? Right? Does the outcome conform to some standard of fairness that we have? And there are, of course, huge debates about the application of various standards of equity to specific situations. People argue endlessly about the link between some kind of general standard and specific situations. But one thing that I think is interesting in terms of the behavioral mechanisms that I'm talking about is one could look at the question, and there's some research on this question, although I'm not an expert on the degree to which equitable mechanisms, if behavioral mechanisms conform to some notion of equity, are they likely, therefore, to be more effective in terms of problem solving and more durable? That's a very legitimate kind of research question. There may be some connection between equity, and especially procedural equity. People may be willing to accept outcomes, goals, rules, principles, whatever, if they believe that they have been developed through a fair process that they would not otherwise accept. That, I think, is a very relevant area for further research. But it's also, I think, legitimate to ask the question whether equity is either a necessary condition or a sufficient condition to develop successful, in the sense of problem-solving, behavioral mechanism. A focus on procedural equity may produce mechanisms that are effective, but fail to produce outcomes that conform to substantive principles of equity. There are lots of processes that people think of as fair processes that lead to highly unequal distributed outcomes. And is that okay, or is that not okay? And there's also the issue of the power of path dependence in the face of demands for equity. Path dependence is a very powerful human, social, societal mechanism which deserves far more research. And existing systems may be very resistant. I think this is one of the messages of the work of someone like Thomas Piketty, for example, on the drift of societies towards unequal distribution and how hard it is to break that kind of dynamic. So just finally, one strategy I think that might be worth thinking about in terms of the role of equity in steering toward sustainability is to think hard about the development of principles regarding the use of behavioral mechanisms that embody, that incorporate within them considerations of equity. So this may be a very relevant concern to be thinking about. So we may want to think about the principle of responsibility, polluter pays, the principle of doing no harm. The idea of, some of you may know John Rawls' difference principle. Inequality is okay, but so long as it advantages the least well-off members of society. The ability to pay, the principle of burden sharing. Voice, the principle of participation. And in general, the notion of good governance. Good governance, my way of thinking, is a matter of participation, transparency, and accountability as sort of principles of procedural equity. So these are a few kind of simple thoughts on this final set of questions, the role of equity, where I'm by no means an expert, but tried to think of some worthwhile things to say. And with that, I'd like to bring this presentation to a close, and thank you not only for inviting me to address you, but also for your patience in listening to a relatively long presentation without a lot of beautiful pictures and animated little bits of all the latest bells and whistles, but just some, I hope, are thought-provoking and really serious questions that all of us, whether we're on the human side or on the natural science side, in a world, in the Anthropocene, as the chairman mentioned in the beginning, we obviously have to think about systems, human-dominated systems, in which we need to to do what RIHN, I think, is trying to do, which is to take seriously the injunction of integrating the human dimensions and the biophysical dimension. So thank you for listening.